So after 2 long years, here we are. It's hard to believe that any of it actually happened looking back. It was 2 years of unremitting, never diminishing hysteria about Russia. It was a continuous wave of panic and superstition over unseen Slavic interference, all stoked by the very people we're told are the most rational in our society. For 2 years, our capital city became a kind of massive CNN panel, a living monument to ignorance and dishonesty, where the loudest and the dumbest invariably got the most attention. We just lived through 2 full years of that. Screaming, threatening, surveillance, character assassination, loyalty tests, wild allegations of treason and spying and betrayal from office holders. Innocent people found themselves afraid to go to dinner, scared to send text messages or talk on the phone. For 2 years, we lived in an all-pervasive cult of personality. Our leaders worshipped a 74-year-old federal prosecutor who almost never spoke in public. He alone was good, they told us. Only they could interpret his will. It was all thoroughly bizarre. Demented, really, though nobody said so at the time. They were too afraid. It seems like a dream now, which actually it was. None of it was real. Nobody colluded with Vladimir Putin. Nobody changed vote totals or met secretly in Prague or had a P-tape, whatever that is. There was never a Russia conspiracy. Hillary Clinton wasn't robbed of her rightful position by Julian Assange or Roger Stone or anyone else. Hillary lost the election because she was an entitled boor who didn't run on anything. In the end, that's what Robert Mueller proved. The news anchors couldn't handle that. They couldn't handle that conclusion. It was too far from what they'd promised their audiences for so long. They were too invested in the lies. When the report arrived in Congress this morning, they found themselves reduced to huffing and sputtering. They couldn't admit what was in the report. Well, they told us, Robert Mueller didn't exonerate President Trump. Okay. I mean, that may be true, but only theologically. Mueller doesn't have the power to absolve sin. Only God can. But in every other sense, Mueller's report was exculpatory. If dozens of federal prosecutors spent 2 years trying to charge you with the crime and then found they couldn't, it would mean there wasn't any real evidence you did it. And that's what happened here. You may not like Donald Trump, but that's what we just learned from the Mueller report. You would have to be a mindless partisan to deny it. A lot of news anchors turn out to be mindless partisans. When the facts contravene the interests of their party, they deny the facts. Then they attack anyone who persists in stating the obvious out loud. So suddenly the very same people who lied to you for 2 years about Russia are demanding that under no circumstances are you allowed to believe anything that the Attorney General Bill Barr might say. Sure, Barr may look like a conventional Republican. He was a Jeb Bush donor and everything. And he does appear to be a close personal friend of Robert Mueller's. But that's why he's so tricky. It's all a ruse. In fact, Barr is a Putin stooge like all the rest.
If you look at his behavior, it is not that of a geriatric. It is that of a partisan.
But this looks like an inside job.
We shouldn't take anything that Barr says tomorrow as anything other than performative coonery.
Is Barr the president's new fixer? The answer to that seems to be yes.
But he becomes the first cabinet secretary to plunge into the deep end of Trump's conspiracy pool.
So it was an inside job. That's the reigning assumption in Washington. Somehow, the Attorney General is preventing Robert Mueller from concluding that Donald Trump colluded with Vladimir Putin and from telling the rest of us about it. How is Barr doing that? Well, it's not clear how he's doing that, but they are no less certain that he is doing that. Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times announced today that Barr's press conference this morning marked America's transformation into a, quote, authoritarian junta. Her colleague at the New York Times, Maggie Haberman, suggested that Trump might be a Nazi because the White House played a song from The Sound of Music, which, by the way, is an anti-Nazi musical, but it's still Germanic sounding and therefore suspicious. These are hysterical children. They should not be in journalism, but they are. In fact, they run journalism, and they have no plans on giving up their power. The Mueller report is probably the single most humiliating thing that has ever happened to the White House press corps in the history of this country. So how did reporters in Washington respond today when it finally came out? Well, they did what they do best. They celebrated themselves. Over on CNN, former Obama official, now posing as a reporter, Jim Sciutto, bragged that the Mueller report had, quote, debunked all of Donald Trump's unfair attacks on the media. At Jeff Bezos' newspaper, a guy called Philip Bump was telling us that, quote, the vast amount of reporting on Russia was accurate. Even they don't really believe this. They know they lied. As we told you a minute ago, BuzzFeed claimed its reporters had seen personally with their own eyes evidence that Michael Cohen had been instructed by Donald Trump himself to perjure himself. This was going to be grounds for impeachment. The editor of BuzzFeed defended that story even after the Mueller investigation took the unusual step of publicly saying it wasn't true. BuzzFeed went all in, and they defended it. They'd seen it with their own eyes. He told us that on this set, on this show. And now there's no question about it. It's over. It's done. It was a lie. That and so much more, all lies. So what happens now that we know those were lies? What do we do with, I don't know, John Brennan and James Clapper? The two of them used to run our most powerful intelligence agencies. For the past couple of years, they've gotten a lot richer than they've ever been from yapping about Russia on television. Only problem? All lies.
What makes you believe that he has more indictments?
Because he hasn't addressed the issues related to criminal conspiracy as well as any individuals.
Criminal conspiracy involving the Russian influence?
Russians, yes, yeah.
Is there influence, whether witting or unwitting, by the Russians over President Trump? And you know, in the intervening year and a half or so, you know, his behavior hasn't done much, at least in my mind, to allay that concern.
So do Clapper and Brennan get to keep their cable television contracts? Probably. In decadent societies, the guilty aren't punished. Only the unpopular are punished. Over on the other channels, they're still talking about Trump tonight, of course. Not talking about themselves or their failures. The line they're quoting most is from today's report. It was apparently Trump's response when he first learned there was going to be a special counsel investigation into Russia. Oh, God, he said, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm effed. Well, as it turns out, Trump was wrong on the specifics. He didn't get indicted. Mueller didn't drive him from office. It wasn't the end of his presidency, strictly speaking. But as usual, Trump's instincts were clearer. In fact, they were dead on. In the ways that matter most, the Russia hoax did end his presidency in some sense. It certainly sabotaged it. Mueller's investigation ended critical momentum from the 2016 election almost immediately, momentum that every incoming president uses to get your program enacted, to make good on the promises you just made to voters. Trump didn't have that, thanks to Russia. Lawmakers, including a shamefully large number of Republicans, who we really should name, but we're out of time, but we will at some point, they were all much happier to talk about Russia than about changing the status quo in Washington, something they were benefiting from, but which Trump ran against. And so they did talk about Russia endlessly. The result? An election that should have realigned our political process and changed this country had almost no effect. 2 years later, virtually nothing has changed. Millions are still flooding over our border from the third world. They're encouraged by an army of nonprofits that instruct them to subvert and mock our laws. The opioid epidemic rages on as horrifying and horrible and destructive as ever. Suicides are up. Our troops are still bogged down in Syria and Afghanistan and many other places. Goldman Sachs still controls our economy. Tech companies are still spying on you, crushing your freedom of speech. You can still have your life ruined for supporting the wrong candidate in public or for believing there are two genders. Most ominous of all and most often ignored, Americans are dying younger and having fewer children. None of this was ever resolved. None of it was ever talked about. The Russia investigation didn't destroy Trump, but it did a lot to destroy this country.
Want to welcome to our coverage now Laura Ingraham by telephone, host of the Ingraham Angle, 11 o'clock Eastern time. Just got off the radio, I'm assuming, Laura. It's the first
just
time,
got off the podcast, Bill.
First time we've heard from you. Go ahead and give us your reaction to the last 3 hours.
Yeah, well, I'm reading through the report, and what we see is a lot of kind of pillow talk among various members of the Trump administration, recounted through interviews with the special counsel's office and dumped into this report. There's a lot of information in this report about what Don McGahn said to the president and what Hope Hicks said about to Sarah Sanders, and most of this information, as far as I could tell, is kind of tossed into the report because, look, the report took 2 years to compile. And none of this information in its entirety added up amounted to a conclusion that the president either conspired in any way with Russia or attempted to thwart or obstruct an investigation that was ongoing. I mean, what we could conclude from this report, and this is all in the, all the way from 72 on, which I'm reading, you conclude in this report that the president was really mad. Well, I think now knowing what we know, he's well within his right to be really mad about what happened and how this investigation began and the accusations that he was traitorous, guilty of sedition. That hit right to the core. I'm glad he was worried, and this is in the report as well, I'm glad he was worried that a special counsel investigation could destroy his presidency because he wanted to and wants to have a really successful presidency for the country. And I think what comes out of this report in the notes and the evidence that he decided not to shield by invoking executive privilege is that we have a president who was anxious to change Washington and to try to drain the swamp and to try to get his priorities enacted and make real advancements for the economy. And he knew that an investigation was going to slow it down or, in the heat of the moment, he believed destroy it.
Yeah.
So
Laura,
people are seizing on this on other networks.
You clerked at the U.S. Supreme.
I find it, frankly, refreshing that the president was that angry because that means he really wants to do a lot, and he has very little time to accomplish a lot in a city that doesn't like change.
Laura, can you hear me okay?
I got you.
Awesome. Barr said in a reading from his statement, the president was frustrated and angered by a sincere belief the investigation was undermining his presidency. That goes to the point you're making there. Andy McCarthy, with us here in New York, says the most significant thing he sees is a profound disagreement between Mueller and Barr regarding what constitutes obstruction as a matter of law. McCarthy concludes that Barr believes corrupt intent is overcome by the evidence that cuts against it, mainly that the president had substantial cooperation with the special counsel. As a matter of law, do you understand that argument?
Yeah, as a matter of law, to prove intent to obstruct an ongoing investigation, you would have to show nefariousness on the part of the president, like a nefarious effort to destroy documents, to prevent people from testifying, from shielding communications of other sorts. There's no indication at all that any of that happened. In fact, I mean, I was shocked that the president decided not to invoke executive privilege. I mean, I probably would have if I were in his position. But again, this goes to the underlying intent question, which is what Andy's getting at. If you really are trying to stop an investigation because you're worried about the investigation's outcome or ultimate conclusion, then you'll pretty much do everything in your power to keep information from the investigators, if that's really your guilty intent. But the conclusion on Barr's part is absolutely right. And not only did the president allow his White House counsel to be interviewed, and this for 30 hours, Don McGahn was interviewed, he not only didn't stop him, the president at no time, and nothing I see in the report indicates otherwise, at no time did the president entertain invoking either deliberative process privilege or executive privilege, which covers the notes of Hope Hicks, which covers the notes of Jeff Sessions, chief of staff. She's the one who wrote down when Trump said, I'm blanked, effed. That was in her notes or her interview. He could have prevented her from both being questioned and notes being turned over. He said, no, let them all talk. I mean, that's extraordinary. I mean, I think you could argue, if you're just someone who cares about executive authority and the separation of powers, you could argue that they were a little too generous in giving the special counsel so much access. Yet, the president just says, look, I'm not guilty of anything. Let them talk to anyone they want to. I didn't do anything wrong.
Well, thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Laura, and we'll let you get back to page 72 or 73 that you were on so you can get through the rest of it.
See you tonight, 10 o'clock Eastern. Thank you, Laura.